special meeting to discuss our 23-24 budget. Welcome staff members and public that may be viewing this session. At this time, I'm going to ask the clerk to call the roll. Present. 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 Here. Okay, we are missing Councilman Broadway, but we have a quorum, so we'll begin the session. The purpose of this meeting today is for the council to review and discuss the proposed 23-24 recommended budget and comment as appropriate. And hopefully at the end of this session, we have agreed upon a budget, agreed in the principle, not voted on it. And then the budget will be presented on June 5th at the regular council meeting, at which time the public will have an opportunity to comment. And then hopefully we will be able to finalize the budget and have it ready for publication and to put it into place come July 1st. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our manager, Mr. Salmon, and he can take us through the schedule.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
First thing we'll do is we'll have Mr. David Hyder from our Stantec Consultants here this morning. He'll go through a couple of slides for you on the public utilities rates and how that works out, and then we'll have Ms. Catherine Gwynn come up and give you some of the details behind the budget. There's 77 slides of information that should help inform you and the public on what our budget is, and then we'll go from there with any questions or discussions that the council would like to do. So without any further ado, I'll turn it over to Mr. David Hyder to present his slides.
Well, good morning.
Good morning.
Thank you, Tim. Can everybody see the slides and hear me okay?
Yes.
Yes, sir.
All right, perfect. Well, I appreciate the opportunity. As the city manager mentioned, I'm going to just go through a few slides just to talk about the water and sewer utilities and some financial planning for fiscal year 24. So just to start off, I want to talk about the financial plan approach and just what we do in terms of how do we look at a long-term projection period, because it's important to look out into the future given the significant investments that are required in utilities. And so what we do is really three steps. The first is to identify the revenue requirements, and that's really just the cost of operating the utilities. And so we have a model that looks out over a 10-year projection period, and we're forecasting those revenue requirements over that period. And so that includes your operating and maintenance expenditures, so the day-to-day operations of the systems. It includes the investments that you need to make to expand and repair and replace the system, as well as any existing debt obligations that you've made to finance capital projects in the past. So simply put, that gives us the total cost year over year of operating the utilities. And then next we compare that to a revenue forecast. So what do we anticipate our revenues being from water and sewer rates? We forecast that based on system demands, customer accounts, and then we do that just assuming you don't change rates. What does it look like as a status quo? And then finally we can compare the revenues with the revenue requirements and evaluate that against some key metrics. So are we able to meet our revenue requirements? Are we able to maintain some key metrics such as reserve targets and debt service coverage, things of that sort? So that's the overall process that we go through. In order to develop the modeling, we need to make some assumptions. So some assumptions here on the expenditure side is that we are starting with your fund balance as of July 1 of 2022. So that's the cash balance we have at the start of our modeling. You've got about $17.8 million in the utility fund, and that's equivalent to about 12 months or a year of operating expenditures. So that's a healthy starting balance for the utilities. And then we take the 24 budget as proposed, and we use that as our starting point to model forward. And so we look at each individual expenditure line item and inflate that based upon the type of expenditure. But on average, we're at about 3.5% inflation for each of the expenditures, and that's allows us to look at operating costs going forward. you do have some outstanding principal debt, got about 23.5 million, so you have some existing debt payments that you have to make on an annual basis. But really the big ticket item and the big driver is you do have significant projected capital spending. As we look at a 10-year CIP, we've identified about $250 million worth of capital projects over that 10-year period. And really the biggest ticket item is the water reclamation facility treatment basin, which would be about $101 million. I know the projects are potentially going to move around in this projection period, but it's currently slated for 2027. Another big ticket item is the new water plant. Again, probably going to slide around in the projection period, but that's 85 million. And given the magnitude of these projects, we are assuming the majority of the CIP would be debt funded. You'd issue debt to support it. And we are assuming that capital cost will be more in the future. So we are inflating these capital improvement projects at 3.5% per year. So a couple more assumptions just in terms of financial planning targets. So ideally what we would like to see is we'd like to have that cash balance within the utilities at least at 6 months of your annual operating expenditures. So we're currently above that, but we want to try to maintain that 6 months. Ideally we would have structural balance, and that just means that your revenues coming into the system would equal your expenditures. And then another metric is just debt service coverage. And really what that is it's saying what's my ratio of my net income to debt payments. So when I have my revenues minus my operating expenditures, whatever's left over is net income. And we want that to be equal to at least 1 time of your annual debt service payments. But we would have a goal of having it be 1.25 times your annual debt service payments. And the importance of this is just if you were in the future to issue debt supported by the utilities, such as revenue bonds, you'd be required to meet some of these higher targets, the 1.25 or even higher. So with all of that, I'm going to jump into the model here. And I know there's a lot on the screen, and hopefully it's big enough that everybody can see it. But this just shows the kind of diagnostic view of the 10-year projection period. And there's a lot here, so I'm just going to start at the top. But this is a baseline scenario. So this just shows what does it look like if we don't do any rate increases for 2024 going forward. So I'll start up at the top. What we have here is your just each of the fiscal years. And then the next section shows the water rate plan. So this would be the adjustments to water rates. This is the adjustments to sewer rates. And again, we're assuming no increases under this initial look. The next line just shows that debt service coverage that I talked about. Again, we'd like to see it at 1.0 or 1.25. And you can see how that changes over time. And then down below that, we just have the typical customer's bill. So this is somebody using 5,000 gallons per month inside the city. Their current bill is $81. If you don't change rates, obviously their bill is not going to change. And then down at the bottom, just have some graphics that show kind of the performance of the fund. So the left side here is the operating fund balance. So as I mentioned, we're starting at that $17 million in the fund balance, and we'd like to meet this target, which is 6 months, that line there. In the middle here, we have just the revenues in the system. So that's the black line. And then the orange line is the cash out, so the expenditures on the system. And then this is the expenditures by type. So we have your operating cost, any cash funded CIP, and then debt service. And you notice your debt service is growing pretty substantially. And that's driven finally by these bottom graphs that show the CIP spending. So this is the wastewater treatment plant, 2027. Then we have the water treatment plant, 2028. This final graphs over here just show how much of that we're debt funding versus cash funding. So purple is the debt funding, and then this is the borrowing amount. So with that, a couple observations. Clearly, as I mentioned, you've got some really significant capital improvement projects. And what that's causing is your cash out of the utility is growing really substantially in the future to fund those projects. And what we see is with a no rate increase, basically we're falling below that cash target in 2027, and you'd exhaust or go negative in terms of the operating fund by 2028. So clearly not a sustainable option going forward if you do have to fund these capital projects and given the expenditures on the system. So the next slide just shows what happens if we go ahead and what we're recommending, and consistent with the city manager's recommendation, is a 4% adjustment in rates in fiscal year 24. So you can see the typical customer's bill would go from $81 up to $84. And then under this scenario, we've just assumed a 4% annual increase in rates going forward. And what you'll notice is that we do maintain higher cash balances, but we do still have some challenges in the future because while our revenues on the system are growing because we're increasing them at 4%, we still have that really significant cash needs given the capital projects. And you can see that here in terms of that future debt service growing. So ultimately, do think that going to need rate increases in the future, that it would be above 4%, given what we're seeing in terms of the trajectory. Obviously, there's a lot of moving parts. If these capital projects move further into the future, maybe 4% would work. Or if inflation isn't at 3.5%, things of that sort would change the dynamics. But finally, we did run a scenario to say, well, what would we need to do to at least maintain a positive cash balance within the fund? So we're below our target, but we're maintaining a positive cash balance. And that would require, essentially, we would get to where our cash in and our cash out are equivalent. And then ultimately, that would be 7% per year, would get us to that point where we're at least not going negative and starting to build our cash back up. And allowing us to fund those capital projects. So with that, I'd be happy to step back through any of the slides or answer any questions anybody has, but that's what I had this morning.
So already any questions? By the way, this is in your folder here, this presentation you just gave. So. Yes,
Any questions for Mr. Hyder before we allow him to go off the net?
Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you,
Appreciate
David.
the
Have a great
opportunity.
day.
You too. Thank you.
All right, and we'll pull up Ms. Catherine's presentation.
You have a copy of her presentation also at your desk.
Flip back. Oh, can you want to see that? Okay. So, good morning, Mayor, Council, department heads, public. Glad y'all could be here this morning. What we're embarking on this morning for the next hour or so is probably the most important of your fiscal responsibilities as a board, okay? So General Statute 159 requires that the manager present a balanced budget in accordance with the timeline, which we have done. And today what we're going to do is we're going to talk about the elements of that 500-plus page budget book that you've received. First, I want to say thank you to all department heads and all the staff. There are literally hundreds of hours that go into producing this book. It is very labor intensive. It's a lot of detail. And you can rest assured that the city manager, department heads, and staff take this task very seriously. And they don't put things in there that they don't think that the city needs to be able to function. So I also want to say thank you to my finance staff. They've worked very hard in getting this book put together. They've helped me through many hours trying to get this thing produced so that we didn't have to contract it out again. So we did this all in-house this year, and I want to say thank you to them for all of their extra time and effort. So what I'm here today to do is to present you an overview. The city manager released the budget book on May the 15th. We did that early, and we were on time. 500 plus pages, a lot of information to try to digest. So what I'm here to do today is to just give you and the public, because this is a lot for the public to try to digest, in kind of a snapshot view over maybe the next hour or so, what this budget is made up of, okay? So that's what we're going to embark on next. All right, so our first slide, this is what we're going to talk about today. Our fiscal 23 adopted budget was about $79 million. This year, it's coming in at about $76 million. And I think the big thing to note here when you look at these two pie charts is that they didn't change much. Your general fund is roughly 65% of the total $75.8 million. It was about that with the $78 million. So the picture hasn't changed, okay? So that's the one thing I want you to kind of take away from this. And what this fund, the total, so remember, we're talking about annually budgeted funds, not project funds, special revenue funds. This is just annually budgeted funds, which means the budget starts July 1 and it lapses on June 30th. We have 7 funds total that we budget. The 2 biggest are your general fund and your utility fund. We are going to talk about 5 of the 7 funds here today. The other 2 are very minor and really not worth mentioning. So we're going to focus our time on what's taken up the lion's share of the $75 million. Next slide, please. So this is kind of a historical analysis view of our prior year budget, our adopted, what this current year that we're in, which we call it June 30th, what we think June 30th is going to be. It shows you what the department's requested, and in the final right-hand column, what is in that manager's submitted budget, which is the book that you have. I think the one thing to call to note is that the department's request, if you look at the general fund, which is at the top, and then the total at the bottom, it was $15 million more in request over the revenue that we had. So that was where we had to cut, and it was in the general fund. We were able to balance the other funds in the department request. So what that tells you is that your department heads felt there were $15 million more in needs that got cut that we couldn't fund. So there are things that they felt needed to be done that can't be done within the constraints of the revenue. But where we came to, in the far right column, manager submitted to a balanced budget, you will see is the $75.8 million, which you saw on the first pie chart, okay? Next slide, please. This is an expenditure summary based on the manager's recommended budget. So in the far right column called total, in the lower right corner you see 75.8. You're going to see me pointing this out because all this stuff ties back together again. What this slide does is break down the types of costs. Your most expensive cost is going to be salary and benefits. It's employing the 482 people that do the business of the city. Operational costs come in second, and then debt service. And we're going to talk in more detail about each one of these categories in the book. We break all that down. We're going to first talk about some revenues, but then we're going to talk about these various categories as well. Next slide. I like this slide because it's based on the previous table we just saw, because it gives you a pictorial view of those expenses. And if you couldn't see that salaries and benefits are the big boy in the room, you can see it on this graph, 48%. Operating expenses at the almost 21 million. So between those two, 76% of almost a $76 million budget. So that tells a big story there. Next slide. And then on this slide, so when in the far right column it says total at the bottom, 20.9 million. You just saw that on a previous slide. Those are, when we're talking about operational cost, you know, that is really what, it's not as big a piece as salary and benefits, but what we do on this slide is just kind of tell a story of what types of costs are involved. There is a column for each one of the funds to show you when we broke these down, and it's kind of like things that I guess have been not necessarily a hot button issue, but things that are bigger costs. That's where we kind of identify those. And then at the very bottom, other operating costs kind of encompasses everything else. Because you have to realize that this 500-plus page budget, there's probably 2,000 or 3,000 lines, individual line items that we have to deal with. So we got to kind of figure out a way to tell that story. So this just kind of gives you a snapshot view of what makes up that roughly $21 million in operating expenses. Next slide. Okay, so this just gives you a brief view of the items that we're going to go over. And if you can go ahead and hit the next slide. So we're first going to start talking about revenues. And because the general fund makes up 65% of that $75 million, we're going to spend a little extra time talking about those revenues. This first slide talks about the $49 million that makes up the general fund, and it talks about the categories. This may be a little bit difficult for the public to see, but the categories of revenues. They are listed there with the top tax revenues being 39%. That's the red part of the pie on the graph. The blue part of the pie on the graph represents revenue from other agencies, which the lion's share of that is your sales tax. They're shared revenues with the state of North Carolina. Mainly sales tax, but there is utility franchise tax, and there's telecommunications, solid waste, and so forth. That total equals about 72% of the general fund budget. So out of that $49 million that you see in that middle column, FY24 recommended budget, $49.3 million, 72%, and this is really important, is made up of property tax and shared revenues with the state of North Carolina. Other things like where we charge for garbage pickup, where we charge to in our cemetery, inspections, planning, police, fire, and so forth, parks and rec. That makes up the other share of all of that. So I wanted you to be aware, because that is a very important slide when we talk about, and we get to talking about property tax and how to make that needle move. Because again, I'm going to remind you how much your salaries and benefits are of that pie. And so when you're trying to drive, how do you fund your personnel? It's coming down to those two big pieces of the pie, okay? And some we don't have any control over. Next slide. So the next couple of slides, what we do is we break down those different revenues that were just summarized on the previous page, and we break down the various categories. I'm not going to spend a lot of time talking about each one. I will call to your attention the first line, which is property taxes, is showing an increase of $1.1 million. The manager's recommended budget includes a 4-cent tax increase. That's generating most of the $1.1 million. There was a very, very modest growth in the assessed property valuation, and I can remind you of Alan Lumpkin when he came to visit us on May the 1st, and he talked about that. This whole thing with the sales ratio. Our assessed value is not going up much, and because that sales ratio fell below that 85%, we had a big drop in public service, which is not a huge hit for us, but it's going to cause that revaluation. But as I'm saying, the 4-cent property tax increase is generally what's driving that $1.1 million. It's not because of additional growth, because of the way that they have to value the property. And when we look down in revenue for other agencies, so this is generally state-type collected revenues, but it could be federal as well, and it could be other types of agencies. The biggest drop I will point out is the federal grants with the ARP is $3.1 million. We don't have that ARP money this year, so that's one reason that number is dropping. We did include about a 5% increase in sales tax revenue, And that was really between the manager and I negotiating about the change, because I'm more conservative. You know, he's trying to fund a lot of programs. We came to an agreement that we felt like 5% was reasonable, and it wasn't over budgeting, because you're going to see another slide later that talks to how good a job we do guessing, okay? Trying to think, really not a whole lot extra that's on this page, but I did want to point those two things out to you. And then on the next page, we talk about capital returns, miscellaneous, shared services, and fund balance. We are recommending a $1.5 million withdrawal from fund balance, but that's because we finished with the ARP revenue. This past year, we went ahead and got it done, so there's additional funds in fiscal '23 that were not budgeted that are going to roll into '24, so that's why we felt comfortable with the $1.5 million fund balance withdrawal. So bottom line, again summarizing, the adopted budget in fiscal '23 was $49.2 million. Excuse me, $49.2 million. The recommended budget's $49.3, which is just a change of a little under $100,000. Next slide. So this slide talks about what was budgeted versus what the actual numbers are. So the blue shows what we budgeted for revenue, the green shows what actually showed up. What you really, you know, if the crystal ball is perfect, you would like to see that shortfall excess on that far right column be zero, right? Because it means you did a perfect job guessing what revenues were going to come in. But when we're talking about in the general fund alone, there are hundreds of line items we have to deal with revenue coming in the door. So it's kind of hard. The biggest blip that, you know, for us is that 2018 and 19, which Tim and I both, we came in, I came in the January of 19, he came in May of 19. So we couldn't affect a whole lot of change in 18, 19. But there's a huge shortfall. There's a big piece of that had to do with FEMA. So we had FEMA Matthew and Florence that were going on. And there was also a shortfall in the property tax revenue. It wasn't as big, but that's what you don't want to see, because what that tells you is, so I don't want you to think it's like, well, every time I see red, that meant that they were too aggressive with their revenues, they over budgeted the revenues, and then they fell short. No, that's not the case. That can be the case. But also when you actually program in the use of fund balance, that will affect your number. So ideally you want to kind of see like a break even, and when you see negatives, you're using fund balance. I mean, that's the story we're trying to tell. So it's not just as easy, well, just push the revenues up. You cannot do that, because you will eat your fund balance away. And as this council is very well aware, you know, the LGC wants us to build that fund balance up. So I show this just to show you kind of like a report card as such, to show you how we're trying to do with our budget versus our actual. And I do want to say that with 23, we have programmed in about $1.2 million in fund balance use, but that was for PO rollover, so that was programmed and understood. Next slide. So this slide talks about general fund balance. Now, the council has adopted a policy on fund balance, and it talks about that policy in terms of, there are multiple categories, but the two big that you're concerned about is assigned and unassigned. Unassigned is the big number you want to see above that 15% minimum. That's not what this slide is talking about. This is available fund balance as defined by the local government commission. So that figure drives my department, city manager's department, quite a bit. So I put that slide up there so that you can kind of see where we are on track. Our last audit showed our fund balance was, our available fund balance was 13.44%. We've assumed that's flatlined through where we are now. Although when we look at what 22 is, we are expecting a good increase, which I've told this council at previous meetings that I'm expecting a good increase. I would love to see it go up to around 18. I don't know if 20% is possible, but what it is, you have to get your books adjusted, and then you've got to get those final calculations. So it's hard for me to just guess at what that number's gonna be. I want to caution you because, you see there in fiscal 15, it's like 51.2%. And that's a bit of an anomaly. And part of what the problem was with that is that a significant debt-funded project was done out of the general fund instead of being established in a capital project ordinance. So what happens is when you get that influx of cash, your fund balance shoots up out the roof. Then when you spend it down, it goes back down. So I think the average of where Goldsboro has been is somewhere between that 12 to 20%. It's 51% is the outlier, and I just want you to be aware of that. But the city is on trend to get to a good, healthy fund balance. We're doing the right things, and that means slow and steady. It doesn't happen overnight, and sometimes it's a little painful, but we are seeing the trend going up, and that's what we want to see. Next slide. So this next slide, user self-sufficiency fees in the, yes, sir?
If you don't mind, just, I know the question's gonna come up. The two slides, can you reconcile how we've been running with reds on that far right column, but yet fund balance has been stable or increasing?
That's a great question. It's because your department heads are managing their budget. And most of the time, we rarely ever see a department ever go over budget because we monitor this like every day, every week. So what you have is you've got lapsed salaries, lapsed expenses, so that's how you're able to build fund balance. Yeah.
Thank you.
And so on our user self-sufficiency fees, this slide is one that my predecessor, she did, and so I've brought this forward as well. And there are 4 areas in the general fund that have seemed to have questions, and so we continue to present this. So the self-sufficiency, I'm providing you a 3-year actual and then a 1-year, the final column is projected trend. And what it's telling you, we're talking about refuse, the golf course, the Paramount Theater, and the Goldsboro Event Center. And essentially, it's a comparison of revenues divided by expenditures plus debt. So think about it in terms of, like, if we look at Goldsboro Event Center in the lower right corner, 40.98%. That means for every 40 cents of revenue that it brings in, it costs $1 to operate, okay? So if it was 100%, that meant balance, right? It meant that you broke even. What you spent, you brought back in. Our refuse, as you can see, is over 100%, which means that it's self-sufficient. It has to be, because when they buy stuff and their equipment is extreme, the most expensive that we buy in the general fund is probably coming out of refuse and solid waste. So they have to be. Now, I will say that when we're looking at 22-23, so these are numbers that I've projected the revenue, the Public Works Director has projected what he thinks his June 30 is, and we're not quite at 100%. Will that number get over 100? It's very possible, because again, I'm looking in a crystal ball, and so is he. So we know that we're right about there. Hopefully, because of the trend we've shown, we will be over 100%, because like I said, he has to be. Now, with the golf course, you can see COVID is in between those years, 2021 and 2022. Paramount, in the 2022, they had some substantial ARPA grants from SBA that helped get them over 100%. And one of my side notes there on the cost recovery, and this is per Adam Twist, because he's the expert in this, that North Carolina municipal venues, their average return is about 37%. So other than that first COVID year with the 33.3%, our Paramount Theater has been above the average for municipal venues. So anything above the 37%, he's doing really good. And as you can see, I think when we look at Goldsboro Event Center, we talk about how booked it is. But you also have to remember that that person that took that position full time, he's not been there a year. So when we're trying to project out revenues and expenses for '23, we're not really seeing that fruition here till like probably Christmas and after, and we're guessing. So there's a very good chance that it's going to be higher than 41%, and that we hope in '24 it will be even higher. Now, will it be at 100%? I don't think that's necessarily the goal, because when you look at those three activities, the golf course, Paramount, and Goldsboro Event Center, those are cultural and recreational program activities. That is a legitimate constitutional use of city property tax money, is to provide for your community for cultural benefits. So are they supposed to be 100%? Are they supposed to be 75%? I don't have a guide. If the council wishes to make that a guide as part of the budgeting process, that's certainly up for your debate. But this slide just is kind of food for thought for all of you to think about. Where do we want to be, okay? Okay, so now, does somebody have a question? Okay, so what we're going to start talking about now is the biggie, the big change in the general fund, which is the 4-cent property tax increase. Right, we can't fix sales tax other than we have our departments that help bring in business, so we get more sales tax. So we have to talk about things that we can affect. We're going to talk about property tax on the next couple of slides. So what this slide talks about is what our property tax base is. I think the big thing for me to note to you all, it's like about a 12-year or so slide, is those blue lines represent the total assessed valuation within the borders of the city of Goldsboro. That line ain't changing a whole lot, okay? It's pretty flat. The green line talks about the percent change that we're talking about, the difference. To note, if you look kind of far to the right where it says FY20 reval, that was when we did a revaluation, so it went, the percent change shot up, and you can see our value shot up when we had revaluation. But since then, how flat that line is. That's very important to note, because that means that basically we've seen little or no growth despite the explosive growth in the housing market. And all of us have seen all the growth here in Goldsboro. And you have to remember, with no growth there, even though our costs continue to rise, and we've had inflation from 3% to 10% to 20%, we've not gotten any extra money to help pay those costs. And so we have not had those increased property tax revenue to offset those costs. So that's why we're having this discussion. Next slide. So this slide, it's an excerpt from a table that I do where I do by the property tax year, and I break down the types of property that go into that valuation. I gave you all basically 3 full years and 2 estimated years, and the middle column is the projected valuation amount that I get from Alan Lumpkin, who is the city's property tax collector. I show you the tax rate per 100, and then the far column is that calculated projected property tax revenue, which goes into that $49 million budget for the general fund, right? So as you can see, in fiscal 21, the property tax was 65 cents. Fiscal 22, a 3-cent property tax increase was recommended and passed, and then down at the bottom you'll see we're recommending a 4-cent property tax increase. And the thing to note, as I discussed the previous slide, the bar chart, we're talking about the value that we've been given to project our property taxes, $2.6 billion. That number has not changed much in the last 4 years. And what that does is it generates approximately $18 million to help fund a $49 million general fund, okay? Next slide. So this slide is also a historical graph that talks about those different categories. So we have the total tax base, which is the $2.6 billion, that's the top blue line. And you can see it's gone up some, but it was mainly reval in 20 that jumped that number up. The next line is your real property, so that's your home. the brick and mortar that we're talking about. The green line further down at the bottom is personal property, so that would be like cars and boats and things of that nature. And then the bottom line is public service, so that's Duke Energy, Piedmont, Spectrum, those types of individuals. They get taxed at the state level, and then they pass that down to us. So it's just another pictorial view so you can see just how that property tax has grown or failed to grow over the past years. Next slide. And I like this slide, the penny worth. So this tells you, so that $18 million in property tax, this breaks it down to what does 1 penny cost. So if you all say, well, you know, I want to spend $250,000 on new playground equipment, you can think in your mind, oh, that's going to cost me a little less than a penny. So it's kind of good to see. Again, what I'm going to say is that penny hasn't grown much, and this analysis goes back to fiscal 2009, where it was worth $202,000, and today we're projecting $261,000. And so for the public's benefit, I'm going to repeat that we have proposed a 4-cent tax increase to add approximately $1.1 million in revenue to the general fund. Property tax makes up about 39% of the general fund, that $49 million in revenue. And also, as you all are aware from the May 1 meeting where Alan was here, the county tax office has already started the revaluation process because that sales ratio dropped to that magic level for the Department of Revenue, which triggers that reval. So that reval won't be effective until 1/1 of 25, which is actually our fiscal 26 budget. So we have this budget and one more budget where I'm going to show you probably next year how flat the revenues are. We're going to go through this again, okay? So before we get that reval, and as he said, you have to remember what happens, you know, if we have an economic downturn in the middle of reval, then we're still stuck with flat. So a lot of variables that are going to go on in the next 1.5 to 2 years. Next slide. Okay, so in the midst of us trying to put this budget book together, we've been trying to do what's called a manual of fees and charges, and that is in the back of your book here. It's presented in condensed form, but it is the entire manual of fees charges. We've never had one before, and so we asked all department heads, whatever fees you charge, we want it so we can put it together in a book to put it with the adopted budget ordinance. The manager also asked all department heads to benchmark, to talk to other units to see, are we where we need to be with our fee structure? So I've presented that. I just did not have time to put it in the big book, so I at least wanted to make sure that you all had that in the book before we started talking about any kind of changes to the budget. So the next 2 pages, what I did was I summarized the different changes. On this particular page, there were some minor changes in some of the departments, but the 2 major ones on this page, planning had approximately 16 fee changes. It's mainly to address the level of effort and cost of service that they're experiencing, trying to get that to more of a comparable level. Inspections had a total of 88 fee changes, again, level of effort, cost of service, and noting that inspections rates haven't been updated since 2010. So it's past time that this needs to be done. Next slide. On the next page with fire, I will point them out. They had approximately 26 fee changes. They were adding some maintenance inspection fees. They were adding some fire false alarm fees. However, Chief Stempien had already talked to council about this, and we're just trying to get this formalized. I have, like I said, you have a complete copy of the proposed manual of fees and charges, which will be made part of the adopted budget ordinance on the 20th. If you have any comments or questions at any point, we just sooner rather than later would help. I know you haven't had a chance to look at this. I want to give you a chance, you know, over the next week or so. So if you do, please come back and let us know, okay? So now we're going to talk about utility fund revenues. We're recommending a budget of $23.3 million, which is a decrease of approximately $1.6 million. The lion's share of that decrease has to do with the ARPA funding not being there anymore. I will point out that in the water charges, we have a 4% increase in all consumption-based fees, as David Hyder was talking about, and that in the water is equating to about a $300,000 budgeted revenue increase. That 4% is equating to zero. And to explain that just a little bit, what we do is we look at what has been consumed and paid so far, and we estimate what do we think June 30 is going to come up, and then we do the 4% from there. Well, the revenues that were projected from my end don't look like we're going to get to what we projected, which means when we try to do the budget increase, we did the 4%, but it's remaining flat. Now, David Hyder is working with my staff. We're trying to go through consumption, which we're talking about 15,000 accounts, okay, and trying to figure out if there's an issue or an error there. But from a budget standpoint, it's showing no increase, but there is a 4% increase that is included within the budget. And we're talking about to be effective on bills rendered on or after August 1. So basically, it picks up July's consumption is what it's trying to do, okay? This slide is just the 4% where we are currently and what's proposed between the water and the sewer and the different rate classes. We have base fee increases. I only put the 3/4 inch, which is the most common, but all of those fees we've got projected to come up 4%, okay? The next slide, Stan Tech helped us with to talk about average consumption, and you can see Goldsboro for fiscal '24 and current. So currently, an average water and sewer bill would be about $81.16. 4% increase, it would be about $84.40. And he also updated all of the comparables so that you could see where Goldsboro, we're kind of in the middle of the pack as far as our average water and sewer bill. And also this next slide, David helped us with to talk about the rate comparison. Goldsboro was just slightly under that average of about $80, with 84 being the average. And now with the 4% increase, we're basically average where that black line is that's showing going across. So we moved just a little bit. So we're kind of like middle of the pack as far as rates for our comparable sister cities around us. Okay. And then I will mention, again, with the manual of fees and charges, the only substantial fee increase we had for public utilities was on the public works side, increasing the reconnection fees, and we're adding an after-hours connection fee. And he's leveling and increasing the water and sewer tap fee cost. This is level of effort and cost of service. And also adding a fee to replace damaged MXUs, which is the brain that reads your water. They're very expensive. And this is only in cases of where it's abuse and neglect, because those cost us around $400 to $500 a piece, I think. They're very expensive. Rick's giving me a look like that's not right. But I know they're very expensive. So we do want to try to recover that when it's a case of abuse and neglect, because they're expensive. So. Okay. And that manual of fees and charges is in the back of your book. So we're going to talk about Stormwater Utility Fund. It is a much smaller fund, obviously, but it is our other enterprise fund. The Stormwater Fund was started in fiscal '18, and we are proposing a 5% increase approximately in those stormwater fees, which will generate approximately $80,000. And I apologize, in trying to get the book together and meet the deadline, I did not include the $80,000 in the revenue. So the proposed manager's revenue number is short by $80,000. And in discussing with how the manager wanted to allocate that when I present the adopted budget, he said to put it in contingency, and then that way, and that's, I've calculated, that's fine. within the confines of that contingency calculation. And if the council, when they make those decisions on those stormwater projects, we can use that contingency to fund that capital project fund for stormwater. So I just wanted to make you aware that that was omitted, but will be included on the final adopted budget if that fee increase is passed. And this table below talks about what the rate is currently and what the proposed rate is going to be, and that's a 5% increase approximately on that. And this is just that pictorial view showing your previously amended adopted budget, your recommended budget in the book. Again, that 1.8 million is short $80,000. So at that point, the change would actually be just slightly positive, maybe about $15,000 or so. And I put that side note about the 80,000 not being in there. Okay, next we're going to talk about debt. So when we looked at the pie chart slide of what makes up the $75 million, debt, that category makes up about 10% of that number. This is just a quick slide by fund to show you what we spent in fiscal '23, what was adopted for debt payments, what fiscal '24 is, and debt's going down because we haven't taken on a lot of debt, okay? We have been very fortunate that we have received quite a number with ARPA. That was almost $9 million. We've gotten quite a bit of ARPA money through engineering's efforts with SRF and ARPA money. So we've probably had $10 million that we've said we don't need it anymore because we got ARPA grant funding on. So we've been very fortunate. So that helps because that helps us balance the budget, right? So next slide. And then the next two slides, what I do, and it's very, very hard to read, but you can see it a lot better in your book. What I do is I break down the different types of debt. You have general obligation debt, which means you went out to the public. SEC, we sold debt on the public market. State revolving loan funds, that's our DENR, where they give us money. We apply for it. It's a very competitive program. And then we have notes and installment financing. So think about that like your rolling stock, essentially. So on this page is summarizing general obligation and state revolving loans. Between those two categories, that's $23 million out of about $40 million of debt that the city still has on its books that we're trying to pay off. So when we talk about that previous slide, the $7.7 million, that's going to help pay down the $40-some million in debt, okay? Next slide. And then this slide depicts, like I said, this is the installment financing contract. So mainly this is rolling stock, IT, leases, things of that nature. I will point out that the items in green are things, green is good, right? So we're paying down debt, so that debt's paid off in either fiscal '23 or fiscal '24. That bright blue, which there's only one at the very bottom, represents the anticipated debt for fiscal '24 that we expect to take on, which is a little over $2 million across all funds. And in the next to the last column, outstanding balance, that's where I was saying the city as a whole, you know, at the end of fiscal '24, the city as a whole's debt is $40 million that we're trying to pay off. And tentative debt, you know, I still have left Herman Park Center on there, even though we don't have active plans for that at this point. At the time, it was about $11.7 million. But for me, as far as I'm concerned, the only debt we're expecting to issue in '24 is going to be for rolling stock and IT of a little over $2 million. And this is just some more detail on the proposed debt. Next slide. So now we're going to talk about positions. Okay, so in the manager's recommended budget, we had a lot of requests for new positions. The manager approved these four for the council's consideration. An occupational health nurse, which is actually going to replace the contract with Wayne Health. And it was due to the cost increase. It was just more cost effective to have the person full-time, and then we get that occupational health nurse 40 hours a week. And I will say that, you know, we are self-insured for workers' comp. So that, having that occupational health nurse on staff is helpful for our rates, okay? And plus, of course, the obvious benefits to the employees. Engineering, an administrative assistant 3 was approved, and the comment that I'll make about this is in that shared services calculation that we do, so where we have the council, the manager, HR, IT, finance, engineering, they get the utility fund and the stormwater fund, which are enterprise funds, get the benefit of having that management there. So they pay over a portion, and it's a calculation based generally on FTEs. They pay back to the general fund. We call it shared services. So that administrative assistant is primarily going to be doing work with the construction manager, and they're going to be doing a lot of this millions, multi-million-dollar ARPA projects we've got coming up. So that administrative assistant will be paid back partially through the utility fund. So that cost is offset. The paramount, that was offset with a reduction in permanent part-time. And in the golf, there was a reduction of permanent part-time in Parks and Rec and in golf in order to come up with that position. So that position was 100% covered by the reduction of part-time salaries. So the next page shows you the other position requests. There are about 10 there that departments asked for that were not granted, that this is part of where I was saying that $15 million had to get cut somewhere. And this is one of those areas which, personnel is our biggest expense, so that was a big one for us. This slide is a historical depiction of the authorized positions. So left of that middle blue line talks about the general fund. So we talk about public safety, which is your police and fire. Then everybody else is non-public safety. And then you've got the third column is your total general fund. Then we outline stormwater utility occupancy tax and our total. And in the bottom right corner on the very bottom, the manager recommended those 4 positions. That takes us from 482 to 486. Now bear in mind, this does not have your elected officials in that number. Your book does have that number in there. That's why there's that difference there. So I do want to point out that, yes, there's 486 FTEs in there, but you've got, I think it's 25 total frozen, unfunded positions out of that 486. So that's how we're balancing the budget. 20 of those are coming from the police department, 3 are coming from fire, and then we have 2 in 2 other departments that are frozen and unfunded. So just for your information. Next slide. And then I did not provide a slide on permanent part-time in your big book just due to time constraints. So I at least wanted to summarize that for you because we started fiscal 23 with 15 permanent part-time, as you see in the notes. The manager recommended is down to 11, and I reconcile that between the departments. The departments are listed across the top, and the title of the position that they hold is listed on the far right hand under the title. And so you can see Parks and Rec has the most. They have 5 permanent part-time positions, which, like I said, they gave up 1 in order to cobble together the full-time position in the golf department. Next slide. So we're going to talk a little bit about salary and benefits because, as we discussed, your biggest driver in that $75 million budget is salary and benefits, $36 million worth. So what I do on this slide is I break down for you, it's not just you're paying somebody $15 or $20 an hour. Government comes with a lot of other costs. We have the local government retirement system. The city contributes 401k. We've got health insurance, workman's comp. We've got group term life, and so forth. So I'm breaking down for you those costs as they appear in the budget, just trying to summarize those for you on this slide. Across the top would be the actual funds. That's what it breaks down, so you can tie that back. Out of the $36 million, general fund is your biggest driver, is $30 million of that $36 million salary and benefit cost. Next slide.
Miss,
Yes, sir.
Before you go back, please. As a former city employee, that bonus Is that the bonus, the end of the year bonus, before I speak?
Yes, sir.
That's something I always want to advocate city employees to get. And I see zero across the board. And we're seeing the trend now, morale and whatnot, and losing positions, people going other places. I want to see that number.
Yes,
I
sir.
want to see a number there. So what options do we have? I know you said we have frozen positions and, you know, salaries that aren't being paid out due to jobs that aren't filled. What options, short of a tax increase? See, now we're proposing 4%, and I kind of talked about it and juggled some things around.
Okay.
What could we do to get a baseline of, say, I think it's $250 now currently for bonus, to get $400 or something?
Okay.
I want to see those numbers looked at, and what can we do to ensure
Sure.
that our employees get a bonus?
Okay, so I'm gonna let her flip to the next slide.
Okay.
I did put that number, it's on the third line down, the
Right.
250 net is roughly about 175,000. So, you know, the council could do a couple of things. I mean, if you say, department heads, you will make a 250 bonus happen, it's difficult. So I would say for ones like you've got fire and police, it's harder because they've got more FTEs. If you would say, let's meet in the middle, you know, if you and your departments can find a third, 30%, 40%, 50%, then we'll fund part of it with fund balance, or maybe you have some other item that you would like to cut. So if you want to do the 250, then I would say it's going to be, all these people are going to start groaning if you tell them they got to find the whole 175, because they really, to cut almost $16 million out of their request, out of things that they legitimately thought they needed, it's going to be painful for them to try to find all of it. I think it's reasonable to ask them to provide some of it, okay?
I don't want to cut, I'm just throwing this out there. I know property tax is a big bulk of this. We're proposing 4. If you say 5, if you were to say 5 cents, what would that change in this figure for that?
It overshoots it, because a penny's gonna bring you about, what I say, 261 roughly. So a penny pays for the bonus and then some.
So we would be good if we were to use that calculation of
Yes, sir.
5 cents.
Yes, that's why I do it, because
I don't want to, I don't want to have any more cuts, and I don't want any department heads to have to scramble, but I mean, I want to put that on the table as well, since such a bulk of the budget comes from property tax. I mean, as citizens, I mean, people want to ensure that they're getting the best services, but at the same time, our employees are the life's blood of the city. And this is definitely a benefit. To see a 0 across the board is, to me, a slap in the face to our employees. I definitely want to see whatever we can do to make this happen, whether it be a penny more, and you said it will be to the good. They won't have to reassess anything, so I just want to put that out there, you know, as an option.
As I can recall, this has typically come out of lapsed salaries in the past. We never really budgeted for the bonus. So depending on how many jobs aren't filled over time, you know, the police department has 20 frozen positions, but they're short 33 people.
Right.
So there's 13 funded positions in the budget, because hopefully we get those people. But you could subtract some of that. There are other departments that happens to over time, where we have lapsed salaries. About 10% of our workforce is not filled right now. We have probably 440 employees of 480, or 484 authorized positions. So typically towards the November timeframe, we look at what's lapsed and what money might be there to pull from. It may be easier from bigger departments that have those lapsed positions than, you know, the manager's office or HR or IT or any smaller department that doesn't have empty spots. So we can look at that going forward, or you could obviously increase the tax rate and you'd garner $260,000, and you know, you could make a bigger bonus, the same bonus, smaller bonus. One thing you might want to consider is putting it in a contingency fund. Last year, because of the ARPA funding, we had a contingency fund. We have no contingency fund this year. If anything happens, you need more police vehicles because you've cracked a few more vehicles, or you need a new dump truck or whatever, you're gonna have to go to fund balance.
Okay.
So, you know, hopefully the city can conserve its assets and operate safely, and we might have that funding available to pull, or you could obviously, you know, increase the tax rate and have that funding available.
Thank you, Mr.
Yes,
Banks.
I think that's it. So in talking about what's been proposed, the manager asked to calculate a 2% cost of living increase, which would be effective for the first paid payroll in July. That cost is around $608,000 across all the funds. A 1% merit, which would be effective for the first paid payroll in January, based on evaluations. That cost is approximately $152,000. As I said, government it's complicated, so we have other things. So in 401K for non-sworn employees, the city contributes 4%, regardless of whether the employee contributes anything at all. They get 4% of their salary. That costs the city approximately $823,000. Sworn law enforcement, they are statutorily by law guaranteed 5%, so the city pays that over. That costs approximately $261,000, with that total cost being about $1.1 million. So you're talking about 4 to 5 pennies just to pay 401K, okay? Our retirement rates, they are going up. They'll go up again next year. And this is for both general employees and then the law enforcement. And I calculated just below, just near the bottom, it says employer contribution increase. Between general and Leo, it's going to cost, just that percentage increase is going to cost $337,000. So it's going to take over a penny just to pay for the increase. And I'm just telling you, it's going up again next year because we already have the rates. Health insurance, we budgeted at $7,368 per employee. So that's the city's benefit to the employee. If you work here, you get offered insurance. The only thing you have to contribute is $50 a month. And so we currently, we're at $584. We had a 5% increase to about $614. And as you all know, not this coming year, but the next year, the state health plan is going from Blue Cross Blue Shield to Aetna. And the HR director, Bernadette, and I, we've talked, and I know, we're talking about what are our options. Because if we decide to go away from the state health plan, we just have to understand, if you leave it, you can't go back. So it is a very important decision to make, for all employees, because it's going to affect folks very seriously. So that's not a this year decision, but it's something we've already been in meetings and had conversations about, and we will continue as we draw closer to this changeover to Aetna. I think it's 2026, Bernadette? Yeah, okay. 2025, sorry. 2025, sorry.
I got one more point to make if I could. If you roll up the costs on the right for the 2% increase and the 1% merit and the additional retirement rate increase, that's about 1.1 million, or your 4-cent tax increase.
Okay, so these are, we've talked about the, I said we were going to talk about the categories. We've talked about salaries and benefits. We've talked about operating. We will talk about capital outlay in the slides upcoming. We've talked about debt. And so the next section kind of encompasses everything. This first slide, we're going to go by fund. This is general fund expenditures. It is listed in order by the most expense, which is police. They have the biggest budget out of the $49 million budget. And we're going to kind of go through those. Not in a lot of detail. I'm just going to point out a few things. If you have questions along the way, you're more than welcome to ask those. But anyway, this is just a summary view for you. It took 2 pages to get it on. And the one thing I will say is when you look at the change to the amended adopted, and it looks like the budgets are going, for most of them, are going up. The reason of that has to do, this is where when you have grant funding in your operating budgets, it skews things. So it makes it look like these budgets went up, but they didn't. You just have to remember they got reduced in the amended budget for this year because the ARPA money came into play. Therefore, what you really are seeing in 23 is like the regular number, but it's got basically a 3% raise in it. So don't let that fool you to think, oh my gosh, we got this big tax increase and all the budgets are good. They're not. It's because the ARPA funding is not showing in the amended budget number. So you can flip through one more. So police, that's your biggest driver in the general fund budget. They requested 14 cars. The manager recommended 7. They had 2 administrative cars, and he recommended 1. We're going to see that when we look at the capital, but we cut a lot of stuff that they needed. Heating and cooling unit is one primarily that I can think of. Fire department, they had improvements they needed. They asked for a fire truck. I know Chief Stimpion's talked to you a couple of times about that. And the manager just felt like we couldn't handle that amount of debt with where we were with just trying to fund the personnel cost. So quite a bit of their capital got cut as well. Next slide. Debt service, we've already talked about debt service payments in the general fund. In solid waste, a lot of these, we tried to point out cost drivers, things that are big numbers in their budget, but you will see in the capital that there were 2 large commercial vehicles that are in there. We'll talk a little bit about those more in depth. Parks and Recreation, as you saw on the position slide, Parks and Rec asked for extra people because they have this lovely streetscape that got added that we've spent $7 million on, and Felicia's department is tasked with having to maintenance and upkeep it. It's not just the flowers and the bedding and the grass mowing, it's bathrooms and things of that nature, but we had to cut those as well. Information technology, Scott, he had asked for some additional people because, as you know, cyber threat is just rampant. The cost of our cyber insurance is probably going to go from somewhere in that range of about $20,000-$25,000. It's probably going to go up to $50,000 or $60,000. It's just such a prevalent threat out there, so he felt like he needed that, but the manager felt like we just couldn't balance those needs out, so we had to cut quite a bit from him. The one thing in theirs is they've got the replacement of the police MDTs as part of the funding, debt funding that's in there. Next slide. Finance, our goal is to get our audits caught up. We are seeing a little bit of increase in our tax listing fees. This year we also have to do the insurance broker RFP. It's time for that again this coming year. So those are critical for us to be able to get caught up and be done with a lot of these things that have been hanging around for a while. Garage, it's basically about the same as we've had it in the prior years. The manager did authorize replacement of an older truck that they needed. In planning, their most prevalent expense is their transportation planning expense, which is 80% funded by NCDOT. Have I got that right, Austin? It's 80%? Okay. And so those are reflected as revenues offsetting that, but that cost is about $522,000. There are some changes that are going to occur. I don't know, Mr. Manager, if you want to talk to the hold and temp and the betterment agreements or anything like that, or if you want to save that till the end.
Maybe to the end.
Okay, all right, be fine. So there are some changes there in planning that we'll discuss towards the end. Engineering, their biggest ask was they actually asked for 2 positions. They got approved for 1, which is the administrative assistant 3. That's in their budget, and which, engineering also does our traffic signals that we bill for, which brings in about $150,000 in revenue in the general fund that Bobby's department manages. I think we're still short that person, the traffic signal engineer, so we're hoping to get that replaced, so Bobby's wearing multiple hats. Paramount Theater, as we discussed, the manager approved the technical director full-time with a reduction of a permanent part-time person. Street maintenance, I believe they got approved for a piece of equipment. I think so. Was it the dump truck, I think? Okay. And city manager was nothing out of the ordinary in their budget. It's pretty stable year to year. Buildings and grounds, they... I think maybe we did have a mower for them that we approved in there. Human Resources, their big ask was the conversion to the occupational health nurse from contract to employee. That was also approved. The classification and pay study was important, but it was cut, and that was a group decision because not being able to fund raises, once you do a pay plan, a pay study, it's just not good for morale. So they went ahead and saved the money essentially because of that. And that's where the 2%, 1% came about. Golf course, of course, you know, they've recommended the maintenance technician full-time with a reduction of 2 permanent part-time. Inspections, there wasn't a whole lot of change in their budget. It's steady as she goes. And Public Works, I mean, the big driver for them is they take care of all of the utility costs for the city hall, so that's why their number there with the electricity and gas is so high. Agency support, as you're aware, the manager recommended $100,000 funding for United Way to administrate the different nonprofit fundings which the council approved. The GWTA funding we have in there is the 353, which has that extra $50,000 that they asked for because they're trying to leverage their grants. Next slide. Okay, street utilities. So this $497,000 is primarily made up of just paying for street lights. You will find absent in this budget the street paving organization. We tried to put street paving in, but we just couldn't make it work. Like I said, that's part of that 15-some million that we had to cut in order to get this budget to balance, so you will see that absent here. In non-recurring capital outlay, we have a portion of that's devoted to paying for the city's part of the retiree health insurance that was promised to these folks when they retired. We also have the economic development incentives, which make up about $404,000, and these are agreements that were agreed to in the past. I gave you a list. It's hard to see on the screen, but in your book you can see all the agreements that we are beholden to, that we've budgeted, which may or may not come to fruition. It depends on whether these entities meet their economic development incentives, and then they apply for payment for that. But, you know, $404,000 of that total. So, you know, a penny and a half or so roughly is what that's costing. Okay, all of these budgets on this page, pretty straightforward, not a whole lot of change going on there. Let's see, Goldsboro event, community relations, really nothing particular to note in this. And then on stormwater fund, I gave you another summary for the expenditures to show you by organization how those monies are spent. So out of a $1.8 million budget, you've got better than probably about 60% is spent on actual stormwater activities. Another portion is shared services and transfers. So again, that's that calculation where stormwater has to pay for the overhead, essentially, that it owes back to the general fund, and then, of course, debt service for rolling stock for them. So this budget is showing approximately $127,000 decrease, which is mainly for reduction. We didn't give as much capital, so there's not as much borrowing going on there. And there was a dump truck that was approved in the stormwater department, and it will be debt funded. Next page. So then we're going to talk about utility fund. This is another slide that summarizes it in the order of the highest part or the most prevalent part of the budget. So that's the shared services and transfers. Next will be the water reclamation facility and water treatment plant, make up the lion's share of that. We're going to go through, we've got slides for each one of those organizations as well to talk about. And next slide. And water reclamation, the biggest driver in that is going to be a $600,000 design upgrade for the water reclamation facility for the 3.5 million gallons. And another priority, but they've applied for grant, is the replacement of the UV system. So that is one that I think it was that DCIP grant that, okay, Bert's shaking his head, so I got that right. In the water treatment plant, you know, we put, like I said, the significant expenditures, and between water reclamation and water treatment plant, when they come to maintenance and they have stuff, it's just really expensive. So that's why chemicals, $1.6 million in the water plant. For water reclamation, they spend a lot of money on machine and equipment maintenance, and it's, you know, things that don't cost $50 or things that cost $50,000 and $100,000 is just very expensive, which is why when David said in his presentation, 2027, 2028, those are going to be big expensive. It's just because their stuff is. I mean, it's just how it is. And in the water treatment plant, the one big thing I will mention is that they've got to try to address the structural issues at the water treatment plant as well. I don't think that got addressed. I think we cut that in lieu of doing the $600,000 for the design upgrade at water reclamation facility. Debt service, we've already talked about that in earlier slides. And the shared services, what I will say to this is that what makes up that $5.9 million is there's an appropriation to contingency of $438,000 that we're setting that aside in case of an emergency. The lead and copper project is $1.98 million. That'll be transferred out to a capital project fund if it's approved, so that we can, and first of the year, I'll probably bring back the project budget ordinance for council to appropriate that money. It is a fast-moving project that they are desperately hoping will have some grant funding, but regardless, by law, federal law, we are required to make it happen, right? So Bobby's shaking his head and he's agreeing with me. So we have to fund it. You just don't have any choice in that matter. And then the shared services calculation for that overhead that's owed back to the general fund is about $3.5 million. Okay. All right, let's see. I mean, there's really nothing particular that is in excess or extra, I think, in these budgets worth mentioning. And then downtown municipal. So I kind of did for these two funds, because they are our smaller funds in our annual operating funds, I'm presenting the revenues and expenditures. In downtown district, it's going down approximately $14,000. It's mainly because of fund balance withdrawal that happened in -- and I did give you a note down there that it was for PO rollovers, which were for software services and a wireless access point downtown. But like I said, they've had a little tiny bump in their property tax value, so they're going to get the benefit of that. And then I give you the breakdown of the expense categories that our director has budgeted for advertising, beautification, incentive, and other. And the tax rate is 23.5 cents per $100 valuation. That has not changed and is not recommended to change. In occupancy tax fund, we're seeing a small bump in revenue. We did about 5% based on the economy and hoping that it's going to continue to grow, because what the occupancy tax sees, we do see the benefit in the general fund in the form of sales taxes, because people come here to spend, to eat, to enjoy themselves. So we've broken that down as well by the different types of expenditures that are going out. We're bringing in $1.2 million, and we're seeing about $1.2 going out. You know, roughly you've got maybe about 35% is going for your travel and tourism. The rest is going towards the infrastructure, because if you remember, it's that 80-20 split, you know, 80% is for your infrastructure, 20% is for travel and tourism. I do want to note that the manager did recommend a withdrawal of fund balance of $250,000 to fund an equipment shelter at the Bryan Multi-Sports Complex. And just due to the timing of the budget, I was not able to get it in here in time. So unless the council objects, that's what we're planning on bringing forward in the proposed adopted budget. Right now, that approximate fund balance in the occupancy tax fund is around $377,000. So there is ample fund balance, and it's an appropriate use of the infrastructure side of that money. So it would be okay to use it for that. The levy has not changed. It's still the 5%, and the County of Wayne funding is 1%. Okay, so finally, we're getting close to the end. And I know y'all are getting tired. I'm glad it's early morning. So in the capital request, Of the $75 million, approximately 5% of that $75 million budget, which you can see here, 3.9 million, is made up of capital. And I think the thing that, to me, to point out on this slide is that departments requested almost $12 million. We had to cut to get that 15.5 million down. We had to cut it down to 3.9 million out of what we thought was the most urgent, most needed capital items. So there are a lot of needs that are not being met, okay, that your department head said we felt like it was necessary, but we had to cut it. So next slide. Of note on this, as I discussed before, the IT director is recommending $600,000 to replace the police MDTs. They're aging out, and it's time for that. I will mention on the bottom this garage service credits, because we didn't talk a lot about, we don't talk a lot about garage service credits because it's an in and an out. We buy the gas and the diesel, and then we bill it out to departments or GWTA or Goldsboro Housing Authority, so it's a wash essentially. But we've got to do some upgrades to that system. As I mentioned, we need to get it modernized, and that cost is going to be about $30,000, but it is spread amongst all these entities that use it, so it's a wash as far as the cost goes. Next page. Okay. Next page to solid waste. Okay, so I will mention there, the manager approved a 2024 rear loader garbage truck and a fully automated leaf truck. The two of those are $300,000 apiece in the manager's recommended equipment. I will say, like with the fire department, they had 1.4 million in requests, and that was without the fire truck, and we had to cut that down to $165,000 in order to get the budget to balance. Next page is our police, and flip one more slide. Okay, so again, Chief asked for a number of cars. We got him down to 7 line cars and 1 admin car. Parks and Recreation, they had about 453,000 in requests. We had to cut them down to 24. And the other thing you have to bear in mind when we're looking at this is some of this also has to do with, can I finance it or not, right? We have a lot, and I haven't seen the list, but we have a lot of improvements and major repairs to buildings and facilities that need to be done, that you just don't go to the bank and borrow the money. The only way you do it is you have to do a wholesale debt borrowing to say, I'm going to spend X and finance X in order to get it done. So I just want you to be aware, just because you're not seeing it here in the budget, some of that stuff we had to cut because we can't finance it. So there are a lot of needs. I'm sure the manager and assistant manager are going to come back to you, because I know the assistant manager's been working on this quite a bit, to come back and talk to you about what these infrastructure capital needs that we have going on. So in the general fund, we had a total of 8.6 million in ask, and 2.2 million were approved. Okay.
Ms. Kathy, I have a
Yes, sir.
question. So when these individual departments request things, whether it's approved or denied, they have like surplus, just use fire station for an example. They have a generator that they budgeted in a budget year, and they sell that piece of equipment. Why does that money not go back to that department since it was budgeted? Why does it go back to general fund?
Well, so if I can predict it, then what they do, and you can see it in your budget sheets, like with fire chiefs in his capital outlay, I tell them, you tell me what you think you're going to get, and then I'll add those numbers up. We are kind of stalled, and because it is hard to predict what that number is, but we use that number as surplus to help offset what their costs are. So we do use that, yes, sir. It's just not, you like to think, hey, if I spent $1 million, maybe I could get 200 or 300, make 20%.
Right.
And we've done better, but it's just difficult market. You might get 1%, 5% of the value on it. So, and of course, the problem is the escalation in the cost. And all of my fellow department heads, they struggle with supply chain issues. Rick, he'll order something and he might see it in 18 months. It's just ridiculous how long stuff is taken.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, sir. Okay. And then on this slide, We have our total coming back to that 11.7 million in asks and $3.9 million in recommended. And at the bottom, I outline, out of that, like 11.7 million, 5.4 million is all that I could finance with debt. And out of the 3.9 million, about 2 million. So the rest of that is cash out of the general fund that's got to pay for that, okay? Next slide. And then this is just another recap slide that shows you between the request and the recommended for this fiscal year upcoming, and then the request and the adopted for the prior fiscal years. So as you can see, we had 11.3 million in asks in the prior year. We got 11.7 million. The number isn't going down, okay? It's going up. But we funded less. We funded 6.6 million in the prior year. This year, we could only do 3.9. So what's happening is that divide is getting bigger. So you've got another problem that's there. Next slide. Okay, gosh, y'all made it with me to the end. So we really do try to make sure that this book is complete. And I can't tell you how many hours and late nights I have spent in red, bleary eyes trying to make sure. But I'm human, I make mistakes, and there's some things that got missed. So in the general fund, there's some juggling that we've got to do in planning, where we're going to increase the contract services. Well, I think the manager told me it was going to be part-time labor and not holding temps for cleanup, so cleaning along the areas on the sides of the street so that Goldsboro looks good, you know, that part, they're going to fund that. And how I'm going to fund that is I'm going to bump up investment income. I feel comfortable doing that. And the remaining, we have about $12,000 in contingency, so that's how I'm going to make up that $22,000. And then we're moving some things out of planning. So Parks and Rec, we're going to increase downtown beautification about $3,000. That's going to come out of tree service and planning. Street maintenance, we're going to increase their tree service by $19,000, and that's coming from the rest of tree service and planning. And the manager told me, I don't know a whole lot about this, but we're moving $60,000 for enhancement areas, maybe to Parks and Rec. That was kind of a question mark. I don't know if you want to add anything else.
So the enhancement areas, as you come out the front gate of Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, along Berkeley up to Ash, has typically been contracted along with, on either end of 70, you see the wing signs, welcome to Goldsboro. That's been contracted out. I think we can do it better in-house for less money. I think Parks, that's a $60,000 budget for that. We can move it to Parks and Recs to make them responsible for it and give them the funding to do it. They'll probably hire part-time employees to do that. Plus, of course, they have to pay for the supplies, the flowers, if you will, or the shrubbery to make all that happen. So. And Rick, I got to work out with Rick, but his people, I believe, cut in front of those signs to some degree along the road edge. And we have to figure out if Parks and Recs can do that or if Rick needs to do that, because we won't have a contractor to do it going forward. So that's that piece. And we're still ironing that out, but we wanted you to be aware of it. I think Parks and Rec did a great job just before the air show. I'll add that, updating some of those plantings out there that weren't the best. And we need to keep that island clean and looking good going into the base. So.
And then, as I mentioned, the stormwater fund, that 5%, approximate 5% increase in the fees was not included, so I need to include that revenue. And then the manager has directed me to put that into contingency. In the utility fund, in the water reclamation facility, he asked me to increase for capital outlay for $100,000 for the installation at Seymour Johnson, a mag meter. I have no idea what that is, so that you would have to ask them what that is. And it's going to be funded with a transfer in from utility capital reserve, because we do have some funding left there. And also, I've got to amend the utility capital reserve to bring that money out of and do a transfer out back into its main utility fund. In the occupancy tax fund, again, as I mentioned, to increase the capital outlay, $250,000 for the construction of that equipment building at the Bryan Multi-Sports Complex, funded with fund balance, because as most of you know, that equipment's sitting out in the rain all the time, so that's not a good thing for very expensive equipment. Next slide. So next step, so just to reiterate what the mayor announced at the beginning of the meeting, the public hearing will be scheduled for Monday, June 5th, 2023 at 7 p.m. in the council chambers. Notification of the publication of the budget and public hearing was properly advertised in the Goldsboro News Argus on May 13th, 2023. We have also sent written notification to all of our large industrial customers regarding the proposed rate change as per our contracts or required us to do. I just bring forth, scheduling any additional budget work sessions. You would want to consider the date, time, and location. The manager has directed me to prepare the proposed adopted ordinance with any changes that the council recommended for the June 20th, Tuesday, June 20th meeting. And then I'll turn it back over to the manager for his final comments. Thank you.
Thank you. Pretty extensive rundown, I think, from our finance director. Thank you very much. Thank you to the team behind that made it all possible for Catherine to roll up those numbers accurately. And of course, the department heads and the staff for each department to put this budget together. It takes a tremendous amount of time, and I'm very thankful for what they've done. So I don't know if you want to take a break at this point, Mayor, and then come back with any questions or keep rolling.
Well, I was going to ask
but
the
we're
council
ready.
if they want to continue working and take a break on their own, or take a scheduled break of about 10 minutes. What do you want to do? Keep going. Keep going, okay, we'll keep going.
All the department heads are here to answer any questions you may have. I'll do my best and then call them up if you have any specific issues you'd like to address.
So just to recap, on terms of your recommendations, you're recommending a 4% utility increase,
Yes, sir.
a 4% property tax,
4 cent,
4 cents, excuse me,
which
4
adds up
cents.
to about 6%.
Yeah. And as Councilman Pollock spoke about, for us to look at a potential bonus there, it might impact on increasing that to 5 cents instead of, or a number to be determined. And then a 5% stormwater increase, correct?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay. So, Council, it may be a little bit premature to say, or we accept that, but certainly we can talk about it. And we've got our list now, breakdown here of the departments, line items. If you want to have any discussion at this point about the proposed increases.
That's sort of a tangential question, if I may. If we were to add something for street maintenance, actual asphalt street maintenance, where would that go? How would that, which fund would that be?
It'd be general fund. So you could increase taxes per se, or you could make cuts. And, where we're going to cut, again, we made some significant cuts already. I would just add in execution this year, we've made so many cuts in the past that you're seeing a lot of budget transfers from each department, from lapsed salaries or wherever they haven't spent the money to cover. So it's telling you that there's not a lot of excess in the budget.
I know, it's been a lot of years since we've done significant asphalt and road maintenance. And, there's core services that as a city are expected. And, and I realize that it's messy. I'm not trying to suggest that anything is inappropriate about anything that we're doing, but, police, fire, sanitation, streets, that's kind of the stuff that every citizen expects. And, I don't want to see, a tax increase, especially beyond the proposed tax increase. But, there's a lot of streets in this city that are really suffering. Some by our houses are really, really eaten up to the point I think a drive down anymore. So, I don't know a great solution.
I would agree. You got to do something less. If we want to do less services, we have to describe what that would be, because I'm not sure that you can go back and pull out, we should probably be doing $1 million or $2 million per year, or do the big projects that they did in the past. They did an $8 million road bond, which, I forget the year that was done. Remember, Bobby, was it I don't know, but it was done before I ever got here, and it didn't finish until a year ago. So even though we haven't budgeted for roads last year or this year, that road bond did play out, and they were paving up until, I think, last winter.
Yeah.
Any other comments? Do you have any questions about the items, the line items in the notebook that we were given. I have one. I'll give the council members opportunity to speak first. I'd like to, if you will, go to page 114. If you look at page 114, you'll see that there is no funding for the Friends of Seymour, which we have funded previously. We're under contract with them. We've funded $16,125, and we did not put any monies towards that this year. That was an oversight, because at that point in time, the issue of the status of the contract was, or the contracted services were questionable, but that matter has been resolved. And if you go to page 309, you'll see there is a, let me find the page myself.
309.
Okay. Am I in the-
309?
No, it's not 309, but let's see. I had it marked here. Help me out, Mr. Salmon.
Are you talking about agency?
The 20,000, yes.
Okay, so on page 397
Okay.
of your budget book, there's an agency support annual allocation
Yes.
of 20,000 budget there. It's not specifically delineated, but when I went through.
Actually, 399,
399, okay?
399. So there's an agency support annual allocation that's not specified there. That money could come out of that $20,000.
Yeah, actually, that's, as I went through further with Catherine, that should be allocated to the Chamber of Commerce.
Oh, we should?
Yes, sir. So if you want to fund the $16,125 for the Friends of Seymour, you have to go look at other places to pull it from. And I think you may want to go take a look at the mayor and council line items. We can pull some specifically. Take a look at page, I believe, let's see, 113, starts to talk about some justifications. There's, on page 117, there's a under the sponsorship, code 3703, where we had the Wings of
Can
Wayne
you hold
Air
on one
Show.
second? Can you give us 1 second?
What's that, ma'am?
Can you give me 1 second?
Yes, ma'am.
You know, you be in church trying to find the scripture. Can you give us 1 second?
I've been through the book a little more.
Amen.
Amen?
Page 117, you said?
Yes, sir. Page 117, on line 4, under sponsorships, there's a TBD line of $5,000. So you could, instead of having it, for a sponsorship that comes up later in the year and having it on a reserve to be able to apply to it, you could take that and apply it to the Friends of Seymour right now. That's a $5,000 line item. And then under 4912 fees and dues, line 5, there's a miscellaneous amount of $1,000. You could apply that. And then, let's see, also on the 1991 consultant fees, page 114, there was an other line for environmental studies appraisals, TBD. You could pull that $10,000. And so if you do that, that adds up to $16,000 of the $16,125 that you've authorized previously.
Well, let me also say that the county provides a similar $16,000 to meet that contract, so it's a partnership with the county and the city. to provide the funding for the Friends of Seymour organization.
I think we could, on page 115, you've got a 23-23 training line for the mayor and councils, and we have the North Carolina League of Municipalities Annual City Vision Conference for the mayor and 4 council members to go to, and that registration fee was estimated at $450. It may be slightly less than that, or less council members may go, so you could also perhaps pull from that line item if you wanted to pay for that out of the mayor and council's budget. And if you want to go other places, we can look at that. But
About city managers,
yeah, we can,
let's look at
That's
that
what I
too.
was about to
can look
say.
at
Let's
that.
go to his office. Yes.
but I don't have too much in there that's fungible, like I put in for the council manager's budget. There is a 15,000 line item for appraisals.
Take my training. I've been in this long enough to reduce it from mine.
So there's some cell phones in
What's that?
here, some cell phones things.
Cell phone stipends? There are a lot of cell phone stipends. And they're not cheap.
I have a couple of questions. I have a couple of questions.
Yes, ma'am.
I want to know, what have we done, and maybe I missed it because this is a lot. What have we done, with the money that we've already increased utilities? Where did that go? Did I miss that?
The utility fund for past year's budgets?
Yes, where did all that money go? When
You
you,
have to pull up a separate presentation on that of what was executed during this year in support of projects.
okay, because I really would hate to see a tax increase. The other thing that I wanted to ask about is, short-term revenue for repairs. When we don't have something, to repair and the money is there, how can we use that money to, where can we put that money?
Well,
To
if
help.
you don't use it during the year in execution, it would go to fund balance. But I think we're spending a pretty fair amount of money on repairs. I just had to do a budget transfer, I believe, last week to help pay for costs and repairs of equipment for Public Works. Do you have a specific line item or something you're looking at that's in execution?
Well,
Besides
I
that?
want to see I would like to see where some money could go. I know that we have got to do some increases. I know, this city needs some help. But I also have a concern with so many increases all at one time. So I wanted to see what we could pull, and I know you guys have worked very hard, and I know you need every dime that you said that you need, okay? But I'm also trying to help the city and the constituents. I'm thinking about that as well. So I wanted to see, even with the short-term revenue, where we could put that money so that we wouldn't have to do so many increases. Does that make sense?
I don't know what you mean by short-term revenue.
Okay, let's say well, you just said we had to pull it up. Oh, like if there was short-term revenue, like repairs, just like what I was
Those would be
talking about.
expenses, right?
Yes, right, yeah.
Okay. So you're recommending, or we consider reducing the budget for expenditures in repairs?
Some, not all.
Okay.
What I'm trying to say is that, okay, do you have continuously repairs do we have continuous repairs all the time?
I think what's happening, Ms. Jones, is that when we don't replace our capital, because we haven't been able to really borrow, our repair costs, and I think this would bear it out, it actually gets higher because we're not able to continuously rotate out a lot of our vehicles, so they're breaking down a lot more. I understand where you're coming from. I just don't think that would be the area, because then if we don't have money to repair our vehicles, we can't perform essential services to councilmen.
No, I'm not saying to deplete all of it, but I'm saying is there at some time that we could not use that money there?
I think it would be safe to say, excuse me for interrupting, but the staff's departments have based their estimates on historical data, and they're projecting their expenses as well as the equipment age and so forth. So the data that's in the budget for replacement and repairs, again, is based on factual data. But you bring up a point there. If these monies aren't, you bring up a question, if these monies aren't utilized or spent at the end of the year, where does that money go? And I
So I think on Catherine's slide, Catherine, what slide number was that? So on Catherine's presentation, she showed you on operational costs, which slide number was it, 6?
Page 4.
Yeah, it shows maintenance in the general fund being about $647,000. If you go to, for Public Works, for instance, in your big book, slide, page 231, you'll see under the garage where they do most of the maintenance and repairs for all our vehicles, automotive parts, there's a $370,000 line item. And Rick projects at the end of the year, actually adopted was $350, and he projects he's gonna spend $370, so we budgeted $370. So he's gonna have to move money from some other line item to pay for those repairs, actually. So we're more than executing the money that's been budgeted in the past, and I budgeted the same as an estimate, so I'm not sure there's much room there.
Okay.
It would have been good if we could have replaced, and the truth is, especially with our leaf limb pick the machinery, we need to replace that because of this reason. These costs are going up so much, but we can't do it right now. So I'm just saying that wouldn't be the area I think we could really afford to cut, because then we wouldn't
Yeah,
have.
I'm just asking, I'm trying to find,
Yes, ma'am, I
Yes, ma'am.
understand.
yes.
Any other questions? Well, I think the next step is for us to take away the information we gathered here today and give it some consideration. We have one more opportunity on June 5th, or if necessary, have another special meeting before the 5th of June to come back and finalize our questions or answer any questions we might have. And then on the 5th of June, it will be presented based on our comments today and further comments for the public's review. And then come back on the 20th of June and vote to adopt the budget. And then it will be put in effect July 1st.
I do have a question.
Yes, sir, go ahead.
So the question in reference to the bonus, I know you said by November with the frozen positions, that kind of determines that. So how do we move forward without having to raise property tax? If that can be an option, but we have to approve the budget by June, how will we make that determination if we need to do the tax increase, or if we're gonna go ahead and use those frozen positions to subsidize that $400 amount that I said?
Well, the frozen positions are not budgeted.
Right,
So
okay.
the 25 positions are not budgeted. But the chief and the fire department and some other departments have less people in the authorized unfrozen positions that we budgeted for. So there will be some salaries available there. As I mentioned, there's a lot of departments that won't be the case for if we try to dig that money out. And of course, a lot of departments are using those lapsed salaries to make up for their shortfalls and expenses for other areas, whether it's repairs or some kind of maintenance or some kind of operational cost that you can see when you take a look at our monthly updates from the finance department on how funds are being moved around in budget transfers. So, I can't guarantee that's going to be there, although some will be there, and it could determine how much you want to pull from in the November timeframe to do a bonus. But if you want to make sure it's there, you could put it in the contingency fund. Another percent gives you another $260,000 to put into potential bonuses or not, depending on what costs arise. I mean, one dump truck burns up or fails and we need a new one, that's $300,000 or $260,000. So we probably might need to put the money into that and then go back to those lapsed salaries to try to do something for a bonus. So
Okay.
when I recommended 4 cents, you know, I
Right.
mean, I was trying to keep up with inflation without being excessive. You know, inflation last year was 5 or 6%, and we gave that COLA of 5% to our employees, but we didn't increase the tax rate because we relied on the ARPA funding. Well, the ARPA funding's not there anymore going forward. And so that's why I asked for the tax increase, which essentially helps pay for your 2% cost of living and your 1% merit, and the additional costs
Yes, sir.
for your retirement funds. So that's kind of where we're at. We would need some direction when you talk about a presentation at the 5th meeting. We will present whatever you're telling us to do and how that lays out into the budget. But other than that, we would expect to hear from the public to whatever degree, and then we could have a meeting after that, if necessary, to make those adjustments. But Catherine, could you come up for a second? I mean, Catherine, in order to get a budget ready for approval on the 19th, needs a few days. So you got to do that meeting pretty soon thereafter.
I do, because it's going to take me 3 or 4 days to compile all of that into a budget ordinance, because I've got a lot of data I have to crunch. So when you change salaries, that's like my hair's falling out, because it takes us hundreds and hundreds of lines I got to fix then. So I need, like I said, with no salary and benefit changes, I need maybe like 3 or 4 days to get that ordinance ready. And remember, we got a holiday on the 19th, so we come back on the 20th. So I just got to have a little bit of time before that 20th, because our agenda's due the Monday. And, I mean, if y'all are okay with me handing it to you at the 20th meeting, I mean, you just have to kind of bear in mind the time frame.
So, Mayor Pro Tem, I see where you're going here. Do you want to make a motion that we change the proposed increase from 4 cents to 5 cents?
I want to do that just to ensure that we get that baseline or that bonus for the employees, and then you have the time to get that set up. Like I said, we're moving with the trend of inflation and everything, and as I stated before, when we came in this office, we inherited a lot of stuff due to lack of incremental increase.
Right.
So denying it or neglecting it moving forward, we're still gonna be behind. So, the employees, like I said, at 0, that's a no. I don't want any more cuts. And at this point, you know, I want to see that they get a baseline of that $400. And as the manager said, if we do have any freezes or anything that we can use money in November, then we can go back and maybe make it $500 with $100 extra. But they definitely need to see something as incentive. And like I said, it might sound harsh, and the public may say, well, you went up another cent, but we're lacking in services as it is, morale, employment. I mean, something has to be done for the employees. You know, I mean, that's just my 5 cents on it.
So you're making a motion.
I make a motion that we go to 5 cents.
5 cents increase in property tax. Is there a second?
Second.
Is there any discussion?
Yeah, so, Mr. City Manager, can you explain, just again, while we're talking about it, when you talked about positions and things that were not filled, and that, how that would work, and how that could fill the void for what we're trying to do now without the increase?
Yes, so the police department has, what, 33 vacancies right now?
Yes.
And 20 are going to be frozen in the budget. So that means 13 positions that aren't filled right now are funded to various degrees, whether it's a police officer that's just coming in at $38,000, or I don't know exactly what that rolls up to, but some of them are probably, you just promoted corporals, so they would mostly be your police officer 0, 1, and 2 maybe, positions that aren't full. So you roll up, I don't know, 13 positions times salary and benefits of that. Let's see, maybe 55,000 times 13. You probably got $600,000-$700,000, but that's providing he doesn't fill those positions over the whole year. We hope he fills them all as of July 1st, but we don't know how many people the chief is going to be able to hire Part of your, what we've been working through on the parking limitations downtown is who's going to monitor that? Well, we might hire two full-time people that are under the age of 20 that want to be future police officers that can do that for us. And they would come in probably at that baseline salary. So 2 of those slots could be full until we actually hire the police officers. So those types of things would potentially be available. But, you know, if you do another cent that gives you $260,000, and what the cost there of the bonus at $250 net was $175. So you've got, you know, $85,000, if I add that number up right, yeah, left that you could put in fund balance to cover some kind of shortfall or something else that you want to fund in the budget. Does that help?
What is your recommendation on this?
Well, I tried to be as conservative as possible. I think we are, Catherine, can you show that slide with the revenues? I want to do a
General
little
fund or-
explanation here. Yeah, your chart with your green line that goes up and down?
Talking about fund balance.
Yeah. Well, no, the rates.
There is one option we could look at, and
That one you showed there with the green, your green line.
that wouldn't impact the tax rate, and that is to look at shared services. And I know it's work, and I know that there's areas out there we could move money appropriately from water and sewer over to general fund to help.
I don't know how much room there would be in that. I think we're pretty close probably, but.
Yeah,
So-
and I've increased that number every year as it's changed. I do increase that number as light goes up.
Okay, just a suggestion. I don't know, I haven't been in those weeds.
So this slide is kind of an important slide here. You can see that reeval going up 15%. You remember when Alan Lumpkin was here, he told you our evaluations are 30% short. So that line would jump up significantly. You have to increase your tax rate over time in order to keep up with that. Unless you're evaluating every 4 years. We should probably be doing that. I've made that recommendation, but that's a county commissioner's decision. Right now, it's going to happen at 6 years instead of 8 years because we're so undervalued with the inflation. So we increased our tax rate a couple of years, 2 years ago, I think, from 65 to 68. That 3 cents was worth about 4% increase. If we go up 4 cents, that's 6%. So we've gone up 10% if you include the 4%. And we're 30% behind. Next year, we won't have the ARPA funding to pull from unless you pull from more fund balance. I think you're going to need another tax increase of about 4 cents, another 4%, 5%. That gets you to 15% of the 30% shortfall. So then the next year, when you get the reevaluation, you're going to have additional funding that helps you maybe do roads, maybe do the things we should be doing as opposed to just kind of treading water here. So getting ahead with a 5% now, and that's not a bad thing, 5-cent tax increase in my mind. That would make it probably a 7.5% increase overall, and the inflation over the last 2 years is probably about that. So I think that's about right. Again,
I have,
but I
okay.
know people have been calling several council members about the 4 cents, so.
Yes, yeah, I've gotten several calls regarding it. I want to clarify something. All this is proposal. This has not been agreed upon.
Correct. Manager's proposed budget.
Right. And so this 5% is also just a proposal. Is that correct?
It's a motion right now.
It's a motion right now, but if it is approved, then it is still just a proposal, and it doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to happen. It is a proposal. Is
Well,
that correct?
correct me if I'm wrong, I'm trying to answer your question, but right now, there's a motion to increase the proposed 4%
Okay.
increase to 5%.
Okay. Because
If it carries, then it'll come back on the 5th of May in the final draft. And then it will be, if it is not changed at that time, it'll stay in the budget, and then it will be approved on the 20th.
On the 20th, yes.
Is that clear? I mean,
Yes.
did I make it clear?
Yes, sir, I think
Because
that's correct.
I want the staff to know that, we really support you, and we appreciate everything that you do. That is, that's a no-brainer. We couldn't make it without you guys, but we also have to look at some other things as well. So, I just want to say that.
Now, how specific do I have to be with the motion to make sure that this money is going, the increase is going specifically for the
If,
bump? Do I have to be specific?
I would say,
Yeah, be specific,
how much do you
please.
want to put into that bonus? You mentioned $400.
$400,
So
based on
$400,
that,
we
with
kind of
that
talked
1%.
about, if you did $400 bonus instead of $250, that would take up the whole cent increase. And that would be set aside in the budget, kind of guaranteed.
Do you want to amend?
That's how I want to amend it. I want the percent increase to ensure, my motion is that the 5% increase proposal is to ensure the citizens go from a 0 bonus to a $400 flat
Employees.
employee bonus. Staff across the board.
So, you heard the amended, motion. Is there a second to that?
Second.
Any further discussion?
So, I mean, I just don't think I'm prepared to make a decision today, but it has to be decided right now, correct?
Well, you can change it. You can undo the decision on the 5th,
It's not.
any
final.
other time, but
It's
you're
what-
telling us what you want us to prepare
Yeah,
in the
that's,
budget.
that was what I was
Yeah, right.
making sure
Yeah.
before I make.
They need to know how to prepare the budget.
And you would hear from the public, probably, one way or another.
Any further discussion? All in favor of the motion signify by raising your hand. All opposed? The motion carries. Does the council have any other thing they want to speak to, bring about? If not, I want to reiterate what was said earlier by the manager on and our finance director. There's been an awful lot of time spent, energy spent, conversations back and forth to get us where we are today. I haven't sat in on many of these discussions, but I can tell you that in my 8 years of looking at budgets, this is probably the most detailed and clearly defined budget that I've seen. The explanations that have been given to us today are much clearer and better than we have had in the past. And that goes to the credit of our finance director, her staff who prepared some wonderful slides in here that helps explain things. And ladies and gentlemen, you all as well. You gave a lot of time and thought. I know that $15 million shortfall that was cut out of your departments was painful to accept. And you've done it in an admirable way. You accepted it in an admirable way. At least you haven't expressed it. You may not felt it inside, but you haven't expressed it outwardly like I'm sure you felt inwardly. And I commend you on that, by the way. It's a tough thing to put together these budgets, but we don't have the luxury of having a windfall property tax that Raleigh and some of the other cities have. So we're trying to make the best of what we have here. And I, again, appreciate the staff's time and effort, but also appreciate the council for your time that you've taken on this matter as well. And to reiterate, this is not a done deal today. So we'll come back on the 5th of June, and they'll incorporate the comments and changes that have talked about today. We get another opportunity to look at it and have the public comment on it, and then hopefully come back on the 20th of June and make a decision. So with that, if there's no further discussion, this meeting is adjourned.